So you've been traveling a lot around the world,
Yeah.
and meeting people from different movements and different struggles. I guess one of the questions I wanted to ask you is, well, two questions. From these broad conversations with many different social struggles, where do you think political consciousness is right now, globally? Is there some kind of global conversation happening, or are these totally fragmented struggles? That's the first question. We could kind of talk about that. The second question is, which of these struggles and projects that are happening right now do you find most interesting or most exciting or promising, really, in terms of the kinds of radical politics that you've been working for?
Right.
So these kinds of, these two questions.
You know, it's very difficult to tell where things are at. I mean, around the world, I mean, I have no idea really what's going on in, say, Indonesia or South Asia or in China or wherever. I do have more of a sort of sense of some of the stuff that's going on in Latin America. And you know, I think there was a time in Latin America when I felt there was a certain coherence emerging, and the political organizations seemed to be, you know, fairly strong. Now we've got a situation, I think, which is a bit best characterized by Brazil. I mean, the right to the city groups in Brazil were very strong. The landless peasant movement is very strong. But now I think all of those movements have a certain kind of difficulty. They're not faring so well in terms of the support that they're engendering, at the same time as there's much more spontaneous action all over the place. For instance, you know, there were about 10 million people out on the streets in Brazil back in June, and it's still continuing.
Yeah.
But my impression is, and probably people won't like what I say, my impression is that the former organizations that were there and were really progressing in some way haven't been in a position. They were taken by surprise, I think, by these movements, and have had a hard time sort of organizing themselves to catch up. So I think you know, there's something in the wind which is rather different. And one of my students, Jeremy Rayner, wrote a dissertation about a new way of doing politics. And there seems to be a new way of doing politics in formation, but nobody knows exactly what it is. But that, and on the one hand, I think the discontent with the contemporary situation is far more widespread, and it's spread to all kinds of other class configurations than the usual suspects, and it's becoming, you know, I think much more prone to these kind of eruptions and sudden bursts of activism. But at the same time, the capacity for organized responses seems to me to have diminished somewhat. But I mean, that may be a good thing or a bad thing, depending upon how you look upon the organized responses. No, I agree with that. I think that the eruptions obviously are you know, moments, events that can leave residual kind of, people have a memory and they can build into something. There's a lot of, put it this way, there's a lot of raw material there, it seems to me, for a much broader political movement. So I don't dismiss the eruptions as simply you know, meaningless or anything of that kind. And I think actually one of the most helpful things in these eruptions is the violence of the police responses. I mean, it may sound a weird thing to say, but the fact that the organized violence of political power these days is so overwhelming that I think in itself then turns that turns people to kind of strong sense of there's an enemy there, and it's a systematic enemy, and who's in control of that enemy. I think this is one of the things you saw in, say, Taksim Square in Istanbul. My impression is that the violence of the police response has had a very important role in politicizing people at a level that they were not politicized before.
Same thing happened with Occupy at the beginning, and that, as happens so frequently, at a certain point it turns, and while the initial police brutality galvanized a lot of people to join the movement and feel solidarity, there was a moment where numbness and oversaturation kicked in, and also fear. I think fear was a really important part. People were scared to take part, which was also very much part of Taksim Square. I mean, talking to my Turkish friends as well. But in terms of the political consciousness being transformed by these moments of eruption, and how the subjectivation of people will continue over time after these moments of eruption, I guess it brings me to this more general question about how we think about movement time, and this came up a lot during our reading group. I mean, there's the one theoretical question about how to conceptualize these moments of rupture in context of longer-term histories of organizing, but also just a question about temporality. I mean, we talk a lot about the geographies of capitalism, the geographies of resistance, but I find less so about the kind of temporalities. Okay, so there's the space-time compression thing, but what about the breaking of that in these moments? I mean, what's the kind of temporal content of these ruptures with the temporalities of capital? I mean, that's a question that I've had actually for a while that I wanted to talk to you about.
Well, rupturing with the temporalities of capital it seems to me a very specific issue, and it contains a possibility of politicization in its own right. But the temporalities of political movements, again, in the same way that capital can be criticized, I think, for its short-termism. I think a lot of the political thinking can also be criticized. And I always find it interesting that the dominant mode of production and its political articulation actually frequently defines the manner of its own opposition, which in some ways is a mirror image. I mean, for example, the whole question of networking and the organization of contemporary capitalism has been very emphatic about networking. Neoliberalism, and all of it that it contains, not only defines the world of the NGOs and the like, but in many respects, I think, in terms of its decentering and its fragmentation, is a mirror image of a lot of that on the left. In the same way, sort of Fordism produced what Gramsci called Fordist people. So neoliberalism has produced neoliberal people, and in the same way that Fordist forms of organisation entered into the trade union consciousness, we've now abandoned trade union consciousness as being the centre of political action, and we've gone to something which looks like a very neoliberal form of... people don't like to hear that either, but that's...
It's interesting thinking that in conjunction